in the market, in the cloister, only God I saw. And if that were the case, how would I treat this person who works for me? How would I treat this person on the other side of the table in a negotiation? How would I treat the supply contract? How would I treat my vendor? Like all of those things, like that ultimately is a quite powerful way to show up in business. The next Dalai Lama may be a community, not an individual. I've never been able to have more fun by myself than I can have with other people. I've never been able to accomplish more by myself than I can with other people. And so we want to invite each other on to take this hero's journey together. That's the power of the B Corp movement. That's the power of business for good. That's the power of purpose. We find that with others, not just by ourselves as some ascetic in a cave.
Greetings and welcome back to Intersections. Our focus is on imagining new possibilities and then forging paths to getting there. New possibilities in life, new possibilities in society, in humanity, in leadership. And today we have with us Jay Coen Gilbert, who has been the co-founder of B Lab, an acclaimed nonprofit that created a global B Corp certification. This is very pertinent to our aspirations of envisioning and advancing towards a better humanity because it really speaks to the heart of the system in which we operate, the system of capitalism, what is right with it, what needs to be preserved, and yet also what may needs to be evolved as well, and what could be a way to intersect profit with purpose and with people. Today, this movement of the B Labs, of the B Corp, is including over 9,500 certified organizations in over 100 countries, all committed to balancing their profit with a commitment to purpose and people. Jay is also the executive chair of Imperative 21, a business-led network that is shifting the narrative towards a more just and regenerative economy, and is now actively engaged in racial justice, co-founding White Men for Racial Justice, and leading peer learning groups on anti-racism. Prior to co-founding B Lab, Jay co-founded and sold and won a $250 million basketball footwear, apparel, and entertainment company. He has also worked for McKinsey & Company, as well as organizations in the public and nonprofit sectors. Jay, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you, Hitendra. It's a very generous introduction. I'm so glad to be here with you.
Yeah. And I was telling you before our little moment here now that it's so nice to be able to share in what is otherwise for you have been such an intentional and luminous journey in life, to share a couple of small little things in common, one year of our birth, which we will continue to allow the audience to remain in suspense. So although in our information-rich society, I'm sure they can sleuth around, on the internet to discover, but we share that and a few years at McKinsey. I'm curious, what were those years like for you?
At McKinsey?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say they were a mixed bag, I learned a ton that I still keep with me. And I think the most important thing that I learned was that was not the career for me. When I saw the partners and what their lives were like, it was very clear to me that that's not what I wanted to be spending 60 hours a week doing.
Yeah.
There was one too many cost cutting and best practice projects that I had been on that were wonderful. And I'm sure they had some value created for the clients, but they didn't feel like they were driving much in the way of societal value for me.
Yeah.
And so for me, the biggest gift from McKinsey was the knowledge that I didn't want to be a management consultant for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And I'd say the other one was a gift from my very first engagement manager, who in my very first professional performance review, he said, Jay, you're going to have to figure out in your life whether you want to be right or whether you want to be effective.
Mm.
And that was a very succinct and clear and powerful piece of advice that my wife and partners would tell you that I'm still struggling with. But that is, I'm forever indebted to Doug Woodham for giving me that advice on my very first McKinsey project.
I imagine was he referring to like the ideal solution versus the practical,
What he correctly observed in me was that a lot of my identity was wrapped up in being a smart guy in the room.
Yeah.
and have a guy with an answer. Uh, since I'm a little kid, raise your hand first in class, go up to the board and get the answer and get your A, or move up faster in the reading levels. Then it was a very competitive sort of environment, and I excelled at it. And then my identity became attached to achievement to being the one with the answers or at the front of the class. And I think what he correctly noted was that if you're leading organizational change, the best answer is the one that moves the organization and helps the organization find its path to move forward at a speed that it can metabolize.
Yeah.
Because if you push it too fast or try to leap too far, there are going to be some unintended negative consequences. And he had enough experience to have probably had some scar tissue to know that, And he was telling a young, probably pretty arrogant 22-year-old to slow down and to pay attention to the people, not just the spreadsheet, and that not every answer was the answer that was a quantitative answer.
Yeah. So what had you studied in college?
I studied Japanese political economy. I was an East Asian studies major, which was like a self-declared independent study at Stanford. So I resisted declaring any major till my senior year.
Yeah.
And was loved to look at lots of different things. Yeah. And at the time, in the mid to late 80s, there was all kinds of talk about Japan Inc. And the big competition was between the US and Japan around industrial policy and other things. Yeah, that would play out geopolitically. And so I thought if I wanted to be relevant and in a leadership position in the business or political world over the next 20 or 30 years, that I should understand Asia, and particularly I should understand Japan. In retrospect, it might have been good to study China and Chinese instead of Japanese. But nevertheless, I studied Japanese political economy because I was quite attracted to the culture as well as just the what was happening economically and politically at the time.
I was just digging a little bit into some of the very unique sort of philosophical aspects of Japanese society, some of the traditions, and there's the ikigai kind of like approach to purpose finding in the world. There's the wabi-sabi kind of notion of really honoring the transient and the imperfect, and all of that. And I'm still a very
I thought the wabi-sabi was honoring the really spicy part of life. Just a joke. Just a joke.
Okay, yeah. No, so it's it is a very unique society, and I'm sure that besides the the domain knowledge of a certain economy or a culture, there is this deeper sort of truths and ideas that must have been part of what you absorbed, in your study of Japan, that are timeless, in many ways.
For sure, the one that comes to mind, Hitendra, is, and I don't know whether I'll get the name right, but I think it was the concept of ON, which was about reciprocal obligation, mutual obligation in the sort of code of the samurai, Bushido culture. And this concept of reciprocity and mutuality really stuck with me and felt quite counter to the culture I grew up in sort of American culture, which, at least to me, prides itself on a fierce independence and rugged individualism.
Yeah.
Out of which comes, I think sometimes at its worst, a heavy focus on transactional victory.
Yeah.
Where there's a winner and a loser, and your object is to win and have more than. And that felt very different when I was learning about some of the deeper currents that were running through Japanese culture, or at least some of them. And the idea of mutuality and interdependence versus like the independence of US culture was quite attractive to me, and in some ways maybe was an early seed planted that led to the B Corp movement and the B Corp Declaration of Interdependence. That sort of is if there's a spiritual document, if there's a values document that binds that whole community together across 100 or so companies, it's probably that concept of interdependence.
Okay, wonderful. Let's come back and we want to unpack more of that, because that's going to be a key part of our conversation today. So you start with this deep immersion in an independent sort of study major that you developed around Japanese political economy. You go on to McKinsey, come with a very analytical, achievement-oriented sort of mind, and then get a little bit grounded in that moment with your engagement manager. Yeah, I mean, when I look back at my time at McKinsey, although I entered a little bit later in my sort of early stage professional journey, because I went all the way on to kind of like doing a PhD and only then took that charge into McKinsey. I kind of have some similar memories. I love sort of what you said about how one of the things that taught you is that this is kind of like not what you want to do when you grow up, and you partly learned that by observing the partners and what they were doing. And this is to me like something that we really underestimate in the way we grow and develop our people, right? And students in colleges and universities, which is like one of the key crucibles you have to learn that you can learn from is just to observe the elders, observe those who have walked, the path on this earth a little longer than you. And you have 5-7 billion experiments like out there that like whether it's like people in the past or people today around you. So I love that, because I learned that too by observing the partners and, appreciating so much about them, and yet recognizing that that's not going to be my life, and a lot of that is intuitive pull you feel. So I resonate with that. And yet so many incredible lessons to learn from that organization that has really honed a certain craft of problem solving in the messy sort of material world. And some of those lessons have just kind of lasted so much, those tools, those insights, those stories.
It would be like they've honed that craft and have delivered tremendous value to those organizations within a construct that says value is about shareholder value.
Yeah.
And they're exceptional at that. There's probably nobody better, or at least, and what would be fascinating to me is if that same amount of intellectual horsepower and talent could be harnessed to help organizations optimize the value for all their stakeholders, not only for their shareholders. And if you built the frameworks and the best practices and the change management tools, and you worked across from healthcare to finance to all of the technology, and you brought all that to bear to optimize the shared well-being on a healthy planet, and not just the maximization of profits for the shareholders, I think they could unleash immense amounts of positive energy in the world.
Yeah.
And that's the transformation that have been working on through the B Corp movement for the last 20 years, and hopefully inviting more and more companies into that community of practice.
I want to hear a little bit about sort of how you got there. You're very, very clear, very articulate, very comprehensive in the framework and the way you articulate it now. We'll unpack that more. At that time, when you were at McKinsey, were these thoughts about stakeholder, capitalism, a form of sort of business that goes beyond purely those who sort of own it from a capital standpoint? Was that already in your mind, or
no, not at all. I had none of this concept in my mind at McKinsey or at Stanford or and it was only a slow awakening. Over let's call it a decade, or more.
Yeah.
And like many people, like the first step was in some ways like, oh, what if we could harness the power of private enterprise to generate charitable wealth?
Yeah.
That we could then be more generous with the profits that we create to do really wonderful things. And what if we could take not only the profits, but maybe some of the technical experience and technical know-how and bring that management technique into the nonprofit sector to sort of help it professionalize and help it get the innovations to scale, and sort of all of those kinds of thoughts, which aren't necessarily wrong, but they are at best incomplete. And they are definitely looking at social change, at the nonprofit world, as a beneficiary of our private sector wisdom.
Yeah.
And as opposed to as a partner in problem solving. And so the first incarnation of the B Corp movement was something entirely different, solely focused on companies that gave away all of their profits to charity. And there was a famous American brand called Newman's Own, that some people might know from the salad dressing, or some people might know from the popcorn or the spaghetti sauce or the lemonade. And Paul Newman was a very famous American actor who had this beautiful, generous heart. And he had these incredible camps for kids, called the Hole in the Wall Gang camp for kids who had terminal illness. And he created this company that would give all of its money away because he knew he didn't need it anymore. He had enough. And what could he use his fame for a higher purpose than just making more money, or becoming more famous?
Right.
And it was, not only did I really like the salad dressing, but I was inspired by that idea, because at the company I was working at, called And One, the basketball company, we were giving 5% of our profits to charity every year. We had, as I was reading about companies like Ben and Jerry's or Patagonia or Tom's of Maine or Stonyfield Farm or The Body Shop, sort of these early pioneers of socially responsible business, they were all giving 10% of their profits to charity. I later found out that was because the maximum amount that was tax deductible by the IRS. And I was like, oh, we should give 10% and we should double it. And then I got inspired by Newman's Own. I said, well, if 10% is twice as good, then 100% is, it's about as good as you can get. And so I went looking around the world for other companies that might have been inspired by Paul Newman's example. Yeah. And the original idea was to create a class of companies called Newman Ventures that all gave all of their profits to charity. And I found dozens of these companies in the US and in the UK, primarily travel companies and water companies and office supply companies and coffee companies that all had been inspired by Paul Newman and Newman's Own. And we were working together to create like a Newman sector of the economy.
Right. These are all obviously like private companies, probably.
Yeah, all small scale private companies. Maybe the biggest one was maybe $20-30 million in revenues. And it was through that, by putting that idea out into the world and meeting academics and some investors and some other social entrepreneurs, they very graciously and kindly and generously helped widen the aperture of my lens.
Yeah.
To come to realize that the money we give away at the end of the year is not the most impact we can have as business leaders, that how we generate those profits has much more impact on society than what we do with the profits that we generate, that we are ending up with at the end. And so the business practices, the products that we choose to be, the pricing strategies that we have, all of those things have far more impact on the world than how we divide up the profits at the end between our shareholders and the community. And so it was by putting out, like you talk about our experiments with truth. And the first experiment was just to say, hey, you know what? I'd like to do more good, giving away all the money that we generate. By being really good business people, we can generate profits. We can give it all away. That creates more good. Let's try that. That was an experiment. It turned out that experiment in one way failed, meaning it wasn't the right answer. But like any good experiment, it pointed you in a better direction.
Yeah.
And that better direction was to look at the products and practices, not just the profits of the company, and look at the company holistically for the positive impact it could have. And that's what was the birth of the B Corp idea.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, beautiful. I mean, there's so much to unpack in that story thus far. I really love the idea that even something that is actually really successful, or is looking really perfect and good and just ready for prime time, there's a story behind it. And in that story behind it, usually there are iterations, there are these experiments with truth, there is a evolution that has happened, and one didn't start like perfectly enlightened,
At least not me. Yeah. I don't know that. Yeah. It's a slow awakening.
Yeah. Even in the much more humble confines of my work, when I look back at the leadership model we developed, etc., sometimes with my team, just want to share the story with them. Some of them have only been here 4 or 5 years, and this work has been going on for about 18 years. And I share some of those stories with what it used to be 18 years ago, or 16 years ago, or 12 years ago, just to allow them to have a healthy laugh. It's just like, Hitendra, are you crazy? Like, was that how you were thinking at that time? It is so much better to do it this way than that way. Well, at that point, that was the best we knew, and so just as a way to also, and I think it really grounds you, isn't it, Jay, in recognizing that even what we have expressed today in our work may in fact be a work in progress. And if this is the evolution that happens thus far, who knows what's to come in the future.
Yeah. We like to say at B Lab, we said early on that the only thing we knew about the B Corp standards for sure was that they were wrong. And so we would lead with that statement, which helped everybody sort of lower their shoulders and relax their jaw and unclench their fists and say, if you can see things that where we have some blind spots, where we're not seeing something correctly, we miss something entirely, or we phrase the question in a way that allows bad actors, to come through in a way that we didn't intend, tell us, because our mutual objective is continuous improvement. Yeah. We're not trying to say that what we've shared is fully baked or perfect. We're just trying. It's good enough to begin, and then we're on the journey together. And so each time the standards would iterate. Now we're in, I think, version 6 or version 7 of the standards. There are thousands of people from all over the world who are actual practitioners in business, in running supply chains, or doing the people and culture management, or working in communities, or whatever it might be, in material sciences, and they're helping us improve the standards. Yeah. And so it becomes a very crowdsourced collective effort where the wisdom of everybody is much greater than the wisdom of anybody. Yeah. And that to me has been sort of one of the secret sauces of the B Corp movement. Is it's been designed to be a flexible growth model, of continuous learning, not a fixed set of standards, a sort of rigid that you apply to people as if it's a formula. Yeah. It's more like a directional set of guidelines and inquiries.
Mm-hmm. So you finished your stint at McKinsey, and what pulled you out of there was not yet the B Corp. That was your and one business.
That's right. That's right.
And so this entrepreneurial sort of like pull comes to you at that point.
Yeah. I left McKinsey and had a few different jobs in the public and not-profit sector in New York. And it became clear at the end of that little run that the person that I had been following or working with was not the right person for me to be working with. Similarly, learn something by, that wasn't the direction, Yeah. And at the same time, my best friend at the time was just getting out of Wharton Business School at Penn, and looking for any reason not to put on a suit and tie and go work for Goldman, and translate his love of basketball into an entrepreneurial venture. And so on about the 20th iteration of that idea, I came down to visit him one weekend in Philly from New York, where I was living. Went out to our favorite jazz club, a place called Ortlieb's in North Philly at the time. And I could not get the idea out of my head. And I started asking the waiter for little scraps, for the napkins and for their pen that I could borrow. And I kept on just writing down ideas. And then we talk about them in between sets, Yeah. And by the end of that weekend, we kind of looked at each other with an understanding that then became explicit that I was going to be going back up to New York to tell my then girlfriend, now wife, that I think I'm going to quit the job that I'm in with the Coro Foundation as their CFO, and I'm going to move down to Philly. We will move together if you'll come with me to start this business with my best friend Seth. At the time, it was called the Basketball Marketing Company, and that was the birth of what became And One. Yeah. Also, plenty of false leads and experiments that led to what And One became. And from the very beginning, And One had like a commitment to give 5% of its profits to charity. So like there was a notion of, we want this to be of value to the world beyond just creating a source of wealth for us. But it was still quite limited to thinking that the source of value we could create for others was simply giving them money. Yeah. And had nothing to do with the products that we chose, or how we produced them, or what markets we were in, or what economic opportunity we created for our team members here, or how we treated the workers in the factories overseas. Like none of that was in our consciousness as 25-year-old, 26-year-old business novices.
Yeah. I mean, that was the other part of your story on, the evolution in B Corp, going away from the Newman model of purely thinking about giving profits away to looking at the whole system itself. And I like that very much as well, because so one of my quests has been to develop sort of a model for helping people understand the role of purpose in their lives, and then evolve into purpose. And one of the things I realized in my study of those who have been really exemplary in their pursuit of purpose is that they got so fused with it that it was there in every moment of their life. Everything they were doing was something that allowed them to express their purpose. I look at somebody like Steve Jobs, for example. very, very purpose driven. And now there he is, stricken with cancer. He's dying. He's even had to give his final sort of, move of retiring from Apple and all of that. But what his sister shares is that in the hospital, as he was being given medical care, he was looking around the hospital room and he was seeing all this medical equipment, which, according to him, was very poorly designed. And if he asked for his iPad, he was sketching, improvements in the design of that equipment. So the person was kind of living his purpose to his last breath, and redefining the parameters of how he lives it based on the conditions he's in. And so I love this idea that in the microcosm is like everything, all of truth can be, compacted into the moments of your life, into the small decisions you make, into the everyday behaviors you engage in. And I think that's what I'm sensing and seeing from sort of the pull you are feeling in going beyond just the, model of donating a percentage of profits to like, no, but isn't it the case that everything we do should be sanctified, should be coming from that, space and place, or what is it that we are doing to help advance, humanity in some meaningful way through our and one work, whatever it is.
Well, Hitendra, you used a word there. I think if I heard you correctly, you said everything that we do can be sanctified. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
And if I understand that word correctly, there's something. Can we imbue every action with something of the sacred?
Yes.
And I think that's a very powerful frame. And one of the things that attracted our family to send our kids to a Quaker school,
I see,
was understanding their belief system that there is that of God in everyone.
Yeah.
And if you extend that to everyone, everything, then by definition you would treat people with respect and value them and their gifts, and you'd be looking for the gifts that they have to offer, not the deficiencies. In business school language, in Harvard Business Review language, you would just say it's an asset-based mindset, and an appreciative inquiry. You use those sort of business terms, but at the very there's a deep spiritual. One can look at that as if it's got a deep spiritual underpinning to it. And at And1, after some really tragic events in 2001, and we were looking for deeper purpose, we created something that we called the And1 service mission. Its lofty aspiration was to move beyond responsible business practices, which was the term of the time, to what we call compassionate business practices. And what we meant by that was that we could look at every action as a service opportunity and expect nothing in return.
Yeah.
Like the purpose of it wasn't the better employee productivity or loyalty or the customer retention or the better press we might get by burnishing our brand image. The value was we got to run the kind of company we'd like to work for, that we could be proud of, that we could tell our kids about and tell our parents, thank you for all the investments in our education that allowed us the opportunity to create this company. And look, Ma, look at the cool things we're doing with it. It was about having that pride and having that pride shared in what we were creating and how we were doing it. And that felt like it had that Quaker element of looking for the divine or looking for the sacred in every opportunity. And to your point of like looking to sanctify every business relationship is one of approaching it like a relationship and not like a transaction. How can this be something that's good for both of us?
That's beautiful, and so needed at a time like this. So let's get into that. You're at And1, 2001. You said, you all hit, certain tragic and crisis circumstances. Emerging from that was this notion of like, how can we run a compassionate business? And so all of this is happening while you're at And1. The seeds are being sown of like the B Corp movement founder.
That's right.
And this was all crucible in which to kind of implement and test some of those early experiments with truth.
Yeah. And that was the time period, like between 2001 and 2005, when we sold the company. Those 4 years were a series of sort of groping experimentation with that service mission. And we did some amazing things that I'm super proud of. And there was just a limit to what And1 could do to take an existing business and sort of repurpose it in that way. There were prior investors, there was a couple hundred employees, there was other partners who had say, I didn't necessarily bargain for this.
Yeah.
And so I'm with you, but I'm only with you about to this degree.
Yeah.
And it became increasingly uncomfortable for me and said, I can't live in integrity with my own desire to have an impact, the kind of impact I'd like to have in the world, within these constraints.
Yeah.
And so I started to look around for other business leaders that were doing things that inspired me that were even further apart. And that's when I mentioned before the Body Shops and the Ben and Jerry's and the Patagonias and all of those. And they were doing things beyond giving more money away. Their actual business practices were designed to have a positive impact in a way that ours weren't. Yeah. And I was really inspired by that and started going to conferences and reading books and sort of just starting to like get myself familiar with folks that were further along the path than I was.
Yeah.
Around that time, we also realized that our business, the fundamentals of our business, meant that we had some changes to make. We either had to sell our company because the fundamentals of the industry we were in were changing dramatically. There was a lot of consolidation. Yeah. And in that consolidated environment is typically going to put lots of margin pressure on the smaller players. And so we had to decide either we ourselves had to get much bigger, which probably meant through acquisition of other niche brands we were going to focus on basketball. What were 3 or 4 other brands that were in different areas that we could be a multi-brand entity? Or that's if we're a buyer. Or if we're a seller, we'd have to sell AND1 so we could be the basketball brand in their portfolio of brands. And the couple years of exploration of that led us to the conclusion that we were better off as a seller than a buyer. And as we were in the middle of that sale process, I came back from a winter holiday and was in the kitchen of my best friend and partner's and college buddy's house. And I said out loud something that I'm not even sure I had been thinking about much more, but it was on New Year's Day in 2005, and said, "Hey, Bart, I think I just celebrated my last New Year's at AND1." And I didn't even realize the magnitude of what I had shared, like the impact or the implications of what I'd shared. And I could see his jaw tightening and his temples flaring a little bit, because he was, as typical, would recognize the implications of what I was saying or thinking more than I would. And he was like, "Hey, I hear you. And maybe we keep that quiet until after the sale is over." And by May of that year, we had sold the company, and I had already been incubating what was by then already this idea of a B Corp. So that migration from the AND1 service mission to B Corp had already been manifesting over those 4 years. And so when we sold the company, I was then going to take the summer off and then start the B Corp movement in that fall. And there's a whole other story about like the digressions and perambulations around that. But that was the genesis of it, was sort of an inadvertent share, an unintentional share that I had reached my carrying capacity for what I could do in that environment. And it was time for me to move on,
Yeah. I had injected, my voice in the middle of that flow. And it's so interesting that you continued with your commentary, and it was about that moment, because what I actually was sparked by is this idea that, hey, Jay, there usually in a path like this is a moment where it's like the eureka moment where it just comes to you and it just gets clarified. All that is simmering and inklings that have been sort of emerging over the last few days, weeks, months, something just gets clarified a little bit. Like, what was a moment like that of clarity for you? And that kind of is what you were also sharing in that moment there.
And what's interesting, Hitendra, is that like I don't know that I've ever had that kind of lightning bolt moment, but the closest I could come to it would be during the month of September in 2001. 3 things happened within just a couple of weeks of each other that really knocked me over and forced a bit of a reckoning. On September 11th, 2001, we all witnessed tragedy with all that happened then. And my sister was safe, but was pulled out of, she was covering it as broadcast media. And she got pulled out of some of the rubble on Vesey Street by a first responder. I had another friend who used to work on the 86th floor, who luckily the plane struck at the 88th floor. And so he ended up getting out safely. Another friend who worked in the first few floors, on the ground level, who didn't happen to go into work that day. And so growing up as a New Yorker, like that was very close to me, and obviously a traumatic thing for everybody around the world. 4 days later, unrelated, my dad died of lung cancer. And so with the smoke from what was ground zero still billowing with the wind moving towards upper Manhattan, where my dad was in the hospital at Mount Sinai, I was driving up from Philadelphia, watching the smoke still days later coming off the ground where the World Trade Center was, and going to be with my dad during his last days with his mom and I. And so then being there at my dad's bedside when he died. And then 2 weeks later, again, unrelated, the most beloved person, colleague of ours at And One, a young man named Jean-Bernard Jute, a first-generation Haitian American who was the most sort of beautiful human being that I'd ever met at the time, who was just full of warmth and radiant sunshine. To everybody he met every day, you were just sort of taken in with his smile and his graciousness. He also was obviously fantastic at what he did, but he just had a way of showing up in the world that made everybody feel better after they had an interaction with him. And he was killed in sort of a freak car accident on his way to work 2 weeks after 9/11, and my dad died. And so those three things happened like right after, one after the other, and it really rocked me. And so it wasn't until after that sort of trifecta of trauma that I was forced to say, okay, am I doing what I'm meant to be doing? Am I living my life in the fullest? As fun and as successful as And One had been, was it my true calling? We've talked before, we got the recording was going about our mutual affection for the Bhagavad Gita and its expression of the yoga path and karma yoga. One of the passages in there talks about living in somebody else's dharma, walking somebody else's path instead of your own. And what was clear to me was that I was walking somebody else's path, even if it was full of material success and a lot of fun. It was still not actually what fed my soul.
No.
And I wasn't really able to see that clearly, or maybe not act on it courageously enough until after those three things happened in September of 21. So I went away for a weekend, a little bit of a retreat with my wife, came back with the clarity of that, what became the And One service mission, which then catalyzed those 3 or 4 years of experimentation.
Yeah.
Which then led to the continuing revelation that, we can do this and we can do this in our supply chain and our practices and the 10,000 young women in our factories in China. Like, how would we make this an amazing experience for them, not just for us? So we think about all those things and which were all amazing. We did lots of beautiful stuff, but it was still, I could imagine more. And it was unfair to impose that upon And One.
Yeah.
And so it needed to have its own, it needed to dig its own foundation and then grow from its own place. And so I don't think I've ever had like the one epiphany, like the one lightning bolt and the light shines and all of a sudden you've got this brilliant eureka idea. I think for me, it took those tragedies to push me to really look inward.
Yeah.
And then to just start experimenting and trying things. And those, and each step led to another step, more like stepping stones across the creek than one big jump or one big turn. And so for me, it's been more like one step leads to another step. That leads to another step. I can see a little bit further, a little bit more clearly. And that's still going on today with what I'm doing. And, but it's that journey that's been quite enjoyable, and meeting all the people that are smarter than I am along the way who help guide me to the next secure footing, right? To the next step.
Yeah. Yeah. So, this would be a great moment, I think, for us to dive into the whole sort of B Corp movement. You talked about how you scoured the world for organizations that were inspiring, initially for their commitment to philanthropy as a place where most of their profits went, the Paul Newman model. But then you started to also realize that's not a complete enough sort of frame through which to really, again, honor and sanctify the true intentions of what, a good business should be about. And for that, we need to look at everything. When you started to develop that idea that we have to look at everything the business does, did you engage in that same act of now going around and searching for examples of more of the Patagonias out there in the world that are, proving that it is doable, and, there is a system and a method that people have at least individually crafted in their own little ecosystems?
100%. And so some of it was, there were individual entrepreneurs, and at that stage in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were writing the first generation of books about their experience. And so you could buy Anita Roddick's book, Take It Personal, or you could buy one of the Ben and Jerry's books, Double Dip, or Inside Scoop, or whatever it was, and you could read Tom Chappell's book, From Toms of Maine, about the soul of a business. And so you could glean from that. And I read with a pen in my hand and a marker, and I'm like sort of really dog-earing and consuming those books and learning about, and then writing down, oh, they did this and they did this and they did this. That would become like a longer compendium of practices. And then as I'm reading those things, I'm realizing they're talking about a conference that they went to with a group called what at the time was called the Social Venture Network, or another group called Investor Circle at the time. And then another group called Business Alliance for Local Living Economies. And so I would then join those groups to put myself in the mix with all of these other entrepreneurs that were way further ahead than I was, and that were gracious enough to welcome me and correct my mistakes, help me put on some glasses so I could see a little bit more clearly and further, and recognize all these other ways that businesses can create a positive impact in the world. And I spent like the better part of those 3 or 4 years from 2001 to 2005 in that exploration and experimentation. And so there's no way I would have landed where I did if I tried to do this by myself.
Yeah. I love that form of data collection that has informed your work, because I often find that we're living in a time when there's a sense of almost like despair and hopelessness that some have about the state of the world and where it's going. When I look back at history and the movements I've studied, there's always been some people who had, a bigger, grander vision for what they think humanity has the capacity for than the way in which people have been operating at their times. And there are always some bright spots in that system, some individuals or collectives who are already living and operating, from that place of higher consciousness. And just knowing that one or a few of them exist, can be itself so confidence building that who knows, maybe within these few examples, we are getting a glimpse of the future of what can be for humanity. Able to innovate, to systematize and proliferate and open up mass consciousness into that.
Totally. I'm thinking about back to the point we were talking about earlier about independence versus interdependence. And individual versus community is, whether it was at And One or B Lab or now at White Men for Racial Justice, like I've never been good enough to do anything on my own. If I've had a superpower, it's been I've been able to find and attract partners who had different complementary skills than I had, where we could work together, because we're each going to bring different insights to the work. And it's the collective insights that actually I have found to be more powerful than any of the individual insights. At the end of the day, the B Corp idea is about community, not about the individual company. In your intro, you talked about the B Corp certification. What I'd share is that the certification is only a means to an end. The certification is only like your ticket into the community. The real prize is the community, not the certification. And the real power is in the community, not in the individual business. Because even the most well-known and largest B Corps, whether they're $1 billion in revenue or $3 billion in revenue or $10 billion, they're still tiny in relation to the entire economy. And those entrepreneurs know it. And they know that all they're doing is creating an example, a lighthouse that people can orient to. But at the end of the day, it's when they work together, it's through collective action that they can have the biggest impact, whether that's in their region
Yeah.
or in their industry or in their country as a whole.
Yeah.
And so some of the most powerful things that the B Corp community has done is they've helped pass legislation in over 40 US states and 7 or 8 countries around the world to create a new legal corporate form that balances profit and purpose.
Yeah.
And that expands the fiduciary duty of the directors so that they're required to consider not only their impact in maximizing shareholder wealth and creating shareholder wealth, but also their impact on all their different stakeholders, their workers, their suppliers, their communities, and the future generations who are impacted by the natural world, that we live in and the environment. At the end of the day, I think this is all about community. My core insight would be that at the end of the day, this is not about me, this is about we. And how we define the we is the most important question of our time, where we've never been more clearly interconnected, whether it's through global health crises like COVID or global environmental concerns or global security concerns. It's never been more clear that we're all deeply connected. And therefore, as it says in the B Corp Declaration of Interdependence, that we therefore have to act with the understanding that we are each dependent upon another and thus responsible for each other and future generations. That's the cultural shift that's needed. That's the mindset shift that's needed in one person and then another person. Then, as you said, they find each other in these times. We really need to find our kindred spirits, particularly those kindred spirits that are across difference of race, class, gender, country, geography, religious, whatever. So, we both believe that there's something beautiful, there's something divine in each of us, and we all have inherent dignity. And we should have an economic system that treats us that way, that treats us as valuable because we're human beings, not just because of what we produce. And that's the beauty and the power of the B Corp movement. And the standards and the legal structure and the certification are all there simply so we can recognize those companies that are walking the talk. They're not perfect, but they're at least on the path, and they aspire to be on that path with others and to call each other in to walk that path together. That's the thing that's most inspiring to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's do this. I want to, for the benefit of our audience, go into your mind a little bit and unpack this whole B Corp concept. You had, some remarkable success with it to the point where there is, I expect, a large number of people who are interested in the evolution and future of business that are at the minimum, at least aware of it. They may not necessarily be very educated in it. And so I want to just take a few minutes, if you're open to allowing us to get a little bit more of an education about it. As I think about sort of those early steps that you were taking, we used to at that time do a contrast between the US model of capitalism and for example, the European model of capitalism, right? And the social democracies of Western and Northern Europe, right? The general sense was that, well, they were somewhat more balanced in the way in which they were almost by law imposing a certain obligation on the stewards and the governance structures of the business to take care of society, not just maximize shareholder value.
Right.
So you must have studied that model or been curious about it, and I'm interested in knowing sort of like, what is it that you found perhaps informative about it, but also limiting about it, because it became the B Corp movement, right? It wasn't just like, let's mimic what's happening in Europe movement.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we were aware early on that in many ways Europe was ahead of the US, particularly around environmental concerns. That's very, very obvious now, more so even than before. And to a certain extent, and like you said, some Northern European countries, some Western European countries, Germany in particular, that has co-determination on boards with a workers' board and a different board, is there were lots of different models that said business exists to serve society, not the other way around. And but what there wasn't, whether it was in Europe or in the US, was a way to clearly differentiate between companies that had really good marketing programs about their responsibility or sustainability or their greenness, and those that were actually performing that way. And one of the things I admire and like about whether you call it capitalism or American capitalism or business is I like performance. Like I like measurement. I find that can be very helpful in making sure that if we set goals, we know whether we're making progress towards them. The question is, what goals are we setting? And do we have measurements for our non-financial performance? Yeah. And at the time that we were starting the B Corp movement, there was very little of that. And so it was almost purely anecdotal. And so you could read the books by Anita and Ben and Jerry and Tom and Yvonne. You could read their books, and there's full of great wisdom. Yeah. But there wasn't necessarily a way to say, when I go to the store, how can I find other businesses, not just those 5, that I'm looking for, so I can make a good, better, or best choice as a consumer, or if as an investor, if I want to invest my money, not only to make more money, but to make a difference. How would I know what I'm investing in is actually performing for not only for its shareholders, but for its workers and communities and the environment? And so it required a set of metrics. Yeah. And at the time, there was a group called the Global Reporting Initiative that was earlier days, but was still quite established and in partnership with the UN. And they had created a reporting framework that said, these are the measurements, these are the metrics we ought to use. But the couple challenges for that, for us to use it was mostly geared towards huge corporations, not the entrepreneurs that were really leading this transformation. So they often felt like not built for me. And the other thing was we asked them, but they were not interested in creating a set of standards or certification that would ultimately be public facing, that would enable to create the market signals that consumers, workers, investors, policymakers could use to buy from, invest in, work for, or otherwise support high impact businesses. And so they said, look, we're just creating the base layer of what should be measured and what it means to measure life cycle assessment, or what it means to measure carbon, or what it means. Like, we're going to tell you how to do that really well, but somebody else has to come in and build the standards or certification on top of that. That's not our job.
Right.
And so one of B Lab's early priorities was to try to get somebody else to build that other layer of infrastructure. We got no takers. And so we said, okay, not necessarily what we had set out to do, but like we will have to build our own set of standards, and then we'll certify companies who meet a high bar on those standards. And we assume that in 3 years or 10 years, there'd be a dozen other standards that we could use. And our job would be to accredit those standards and say, oh, you could get a 5 stars over here, or platinum over there, or 67 over here, or whatever the, 4 roses or sunflowers, whatever it is. And there'd be a bunch of different standards that we could use. And as it turned out, in now almost 20 years, almost nobody's done that except for. And so very surprising to me, B Lab still has the most comprehensive and rigorous set of social and environmental performance standards that can measure the impact of a company on its non-financial stakeholders, right? On its workers, community, suppliers, employees, environment. And so we had to create the standards using the base layer that was already out there, and using all those books that I mentioned before, and capturing all the practices that they were actually doing, and then saying, oh, here are worker practices, here are community practice, here are environmental practice, here are governance practices, and put them into one coherent framework. Yeah. And then the most important thing was to then go out and recruit the first wave of companies, right, who would be willing to say, I'm willing to be held accountable, right, to a third-party set of standards that didn't exist before, when they were likely already doing the work and already recognized for doing the work, which was then counterintuitive. Why would I go through the pain in the butt of going through your certification, let alone pay you? Yeah. So you can put a little B Corp logo that nobody knows what it is on my door, on my website, or on my packaging, when no one knows what the heck that is. Why would I do that when I'm already known as a beneficial company, a responsible business, et cetera? And the most inspiring thing was all of those early entrepreneurs knew that they needed collective voice and they needed third-party validation, or else it's just them arguing that they're doing good stuff. And then all the bigger multinationals were going to recognize a good market opportunity and then hire a great marketing firm to market using those same words, but not necessarily be backed up by the same practices. Yeah. And that created an existential threat for those early entrepreneurs to distinguish themselves. And so they realized it was in their long-term interest as a company, but more importantly, in their interest as changemakers.
Yeah.
To build collective power and collective voice. And so that's when they all said, look, we know these standards aren't perfect, but we recognize this is needed. And we know that you need us to give this credibility.
Yeah.
And so when those first 81 companies became the founding B corporations in 2007, they're the ones who really created the B Corp movement, not B Lab.
Yeah.
B Lab just created the platform.
Yeah.
But it was only when they stood on the platform and they spoke their own experience of why this was important to them.
Yes.
And why when they told their peers that this is the next path, that's what created the B Corp movement. And that started in the US. And then within 3 or 5 years, our friends at Sistema Bay helped build that in Latin America, and then in Europe, and then in Africa and Asia. And it proliferated because entrepreneurs, as you said, they were finding their tribe.
Yeah.
In difficult times, right? Financial crisis in 2008, right? So we were born into a period of global economic dislocation.
Yeah.
The BP oil spill, the financial crisis, and all of a sudden, these entrepreneurs are now showing up as a collective, as a family, as a community. And that was really intriguing because people want to go to a fun party. They were having a good party. And who doesn't want to go to a good party? It's playing good music, everybody's dancing, they're that looked like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And for entrepreneurs whose identity was like, I'm on the cutting edge, I'm a leader. If that's where the leaders are, then I want to be with them. And that created this sort of a snowball effect, a multiplier effect that now we see we're close to or just over 10,000 B Corps in over 100 countries because they see each other and they want to be seen as part of that peer group. And they know they can do things together like drive to net zero on climate, or reduce inequality between lowest and highest paid employees, or change corporate law to make sure it's accountable to create value for all stakeholders. They can do those things together in a way that they could never do alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. How much has this hit the public markets, or are most of these private companies?
There are probably about somewhere between 30 and 40 publicly traded certified B Corps, ranging from, unicorn, tech funded startups to multi-billion dollar, Brazilian steel companies.
I see.
And the overwhelming majority of companies in the B Corp movement, just like the overwhelming number of companies in the global economy, are private. Like there's only like 3,500 publicly traded companies in the US, and there's 7 million businesses. So in general, there's always more private companies than public companies, and there's always more smaller companies than big companies. But what's been really gratifying about the B Corp structure that we've created is it's been quite scalable, across industries, across geographies, and across size.
Yeah.
And so you have big global companies like Danone, the yogurt, the dairy company that certified its North American subsidiary, like a $10, $11 billion subsidiary. And then has been the process over the last 5 or 7 years of certifying now upwards of 30 or 40% of its global subsidiaries on the path to becoming certified as a whole, right? Which would become, the $30 or $40 billion company would be by far and away the largest, B Corp, certified B Corp in the world. Yeah. But Hitendra, beyond those publicly traded certified B Corps, there's also hundreds and hundreds of companies that have adopted the legal structure.
I see.
That B Corps have created. It's called a benefit corporation. It's a corporate form, a distinct corporate form called a benefit corporation. And there are 30,000 companies around the world that have adopted that legal structure, about half of those in the US and half outside the US. And while they haven't become certified B Corps, meaning they haven't met the performance standards of the certified community, they have adopted the legal framework, which has formally expanded the fiduciary duty of their directors.
Yeah. And
some of those are some of the most prominent AI companies and other folks that are doing, medical device companies and other folks that have said, or, for-profit higher ed companies that know that they've got a problem with brand perception, that they're in a predatory industry. And so they have to signal to the marketplace that they're approaching. There are marketplaces in emerging markets where public education isn't a great option. And so having high quality, affordable, accessible private education is actually a pathway to creating broad-based economic development and a growth of a middle class. But they want to make sure that people know that they're approaching that in a way that is best for students, not just best for their shareholders. And so there are hundreds of publicly traded benefit corporations that have adopted that stakeholder governance model. And there, like I said, and there are dozens of certified B Corps that are publicly traded.
Yeah, fantastic. A really wonderful, like, two-pronged sort of approach towards, bringing this kind of, call it social innovation or almost like spiritual innovation into the world. I want to, for a moment, just invite you to share sort of what you have been observing as the world itself has gone through its excitement and then also a little bit of deflation around ESG, right? And so I think you pioneered, some of these ideas and aspirations at a time, and they were still not largely in the public consciousness. Suddenly ESG becomes like a bigger, cooler thing. And then the CEO roundtable comes up with its, kind of statement on, the purpose, as being very core to any corporation. And so for a while, we are riding that wave where, as you were saying, many companies were at least starting to get attentive to this. And Wall Street was basically coming up with all kinds of reports about how much more money you can make if you're actually going to be really into the ESG sort of, wave. And then, things start to flounder. Partly it is, certain pushback from those who weren't as comfortable with the nature and pace and tenor, of some of these kinds of reforms, and partly through just economic challenges that at times businesses have faced. And they found it to be important to actually be a little bit more economically, I guess, invested in kind of the choices they're making around their, anyway, and you're all of that, that history that's now for the last about 10 years. And I'm curious, you as a pioneer coming from a much more longer term, pure-hearted driven sort of motivation to do this work, how have you felt about these dynamics and drama that has unfolded in the larger business world?
Well, I'm happy to answer that, Hitendra, but I'm curious, like, from your standpoint, from where you sit, what do you think has caused the slowdown or even the reversal or retrenchment around these things, either in the corporate world or in the capital markets? From your perspective, what do you think what was driving the growth of this market, and then what has driven like the pushback?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. By the way, I've faced certain similar, I think, dynamics in the way I've observed the evolution of the honoring of the inner life in business and in society more broadly in America, where that's been a key part of my focus and my teaching, that the inner life really matters. And, for a while, like, I was one of just very few business school professors building a class on the inner life, and suddenly just exploded in the last about 10, 15 years. And then Adam Grant had to write a New York Times op-ed about how he said, I don't meditate. And it's not cool for you guys to come up to me at parties and tell me, like, do you meditate? And don't make me feel guilty because I don't meditate. Because suddenly something like this, which, some people may have been doing quietly in their own homes, became not just ultra like accepted, it actually became like super fashionable and cool, and then it became like almost uncool not to meditate, kind of thing. And so it's going through its kind of, interesting waves as well, the inner life and celebration and honoring of the inner life. Yeah, well, so coming back to your point, both for that, that surge that I've seen there, as well as what I saw in my own very untutored way in the ESG movement, which you will, I'm sure, inform us with, a lot more clarity and wisdom. First, there is just this thing in America, like that we are in some ways at times at the mass level a little bit fad driven. We get excited about the next new thing, next new shiny object, and for a while that surge then takes us to a place where it's more, more based on emotional surge and a certain sort of just performative outer kind of like desire to want to conform and engage with something, rather than a deep fundamental shift, in consciousness as to the real roots of whatever it is that movement was about. And I think some percentage of the ESG wave in more broader terms probably was amplified, by that kind of a little bit more, superficial energy rather than deep shifts in people's consciousness. I used to have some conversation at that time with some banker friends, at a couple of the big banks in Wall Street. And I was saying, like, look, what you guys are doing is a little bit dangerous, because you're writing these reports, which are basically claiming and showing that, oh, you get better brand, premium pricing, you get better customer loyalty, you get better investor, support as well, when you are following some of these ESG standards. because and therefore you end up making more money in terms of your shareholder value, and all that. Because I'm saying basically what you're telling people is that if you do ESG, you make more money.
Right.
Well, if that is what you're saying, you're basically saying the most important thing is to make money, and ESG is just an enabler. Well, tomorrow, if they find a better way to make money by doing really crappy and bad things, well, then that will be the next wave of reports you write. Is that right? Yeah. So, and instead, what I found, at least in studying, I mean, look, you're a lot more tutored in this, so you please educate us. But just in a couple of happenstance data points, whether it's the Patagonias or even with Steve Jobs and what he was doing at Apple, and one of our clients, dear and beloved and beautiful company in Texas called HEB, America's largest private company today, actually, in terms of number of employees, 160,000 plus, $45-50 billion in sales in the grocery industry, but very, very, very purpose driven. And what I find with these organizations or data points is that it's not that they're doing like purpose and planet work because it'll make money.
Mhm.
They are making money so that they can do purpose and planet work.
Right.
So
Right.
so they are reversing it, right? And so yeah, to your point, what I've observed is that some of the search was a little bit sort of artificial in terms of being sort of newsworthy on the outside, but not really fundamentally shifting human motivations and intentions on the inside yet, and not having as much of a revolution in the boardroom as much as we probably need and that you're trying to go for. So it kind of had to get pricked at some point. But at the same time, this is an irreversible trend, as best I can, because humanity is hungering for something more, and we are reaching the limits to the current system in terms of the growing income inequalities, the environmental stress and tension is putting up, and kind of the big blow-ups that are happening now and then, where you suddenly realize, my God, there was, a very mismanaged set of intentions underlying, the way this business was being run. So I do see the pace, not being as fast as what it looked to be from the outside, but still being quite irreversible, the steps that are being taken. Anyways, back to you.
Yeah. No, Hitendra, I agree with everything you shared. The growth of that marketplace was a bit inflated, where we were counting things that weren't worthy. They were pretty thin practices, and so it felt pretty inflated, and things that we called ESG sometimes weren't particularly high impact.
Yeah.
On forget about financially, just like in socially or environmentally, what their stated impact was supposed to be. So there's plenty to criticize in that market, right? At B Lab, in some ways, and the B Corp movement was in some ways created as an answer to those criticisms, to say where there are real rigorous third-party validated standards that are comprehensive about a company's performance, and we can believe in these. They're not perfect, but we can believe in them in a way. And that's a much smaller market, even if it's growing rapidly. It's a much smaller market than the ESG investing space. And so I do agree that it was a bit fluffy. I also agree that there's at the core of this conversation is a conversation about purpose, about what is the ultimate objective. It's about ends and means.
Yeah.
And so as you really beautifully said, if you're making the case to run a good business simply on the fact that it's better for your shareholders, if that's your entire reason for making the case, then as soon as there's something better for your shareholders, they're going to go do that. And so it builds your castle on sand. And so there is a famous letter that Martin Luther King wrote from the Birmingham jail. And among the people he's addressing, the primary people he's addressing in the heart of the civil rights movement, 1963, he is addressing the white moderate.
Yeah.
He says, the biggest impediment to change isn't the members of the White Citizens Council or the people wearing those funny looking hats, part of the Ku Klux Klan or burning crosses. That's not the biggest impediment. The biggest impediment is the white moderate who says, not now, be patient, you're going too fast, you're being a little bit too radical. That was the biggest eroder of momentum.
Yeah.
And so an article I've always wanted to write, partner with somebody on, is the letter from the business case jail.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think we imprison ourselves in a business case jail where the only legitimate reason we can give for doing something is that it makes more money.
Yeah.
And that is a prison. It's a prison ethically. It's a prison for our humanity. Our full humanity cannot flourish
Yes.
in a system that only measures and only values money.
Yeah.
And so we have locked ourselves in a prison. The good news is that we have the key.
Yeah.
We can unlock that door
Yeah.
and decide that we're going to measure the worth of, just like we measure the worth of a man or a woman, of course, on the content of their character and how they show up in the world, how they treat other people.
Yeah.
We should take the measure of a business by how they treat other people,
Yeah.
not just the people with the most money sitting in the boardroom as shareholders.
Yeah.
And the B Corp movement is one path to that. I'm hopeful that there'll be many, many others, right? Of course.
Yeah.
And maybe the B Corp is just a transitional object towards something even greater and more beautiful on the other side. But for now, it's a pretty good, at best, transitional step to say we're going to hold ourselves accountable to not only measure our profits, but to measure our performance at achieving our purpose, our higher purpose, which is to not only be better for our shareholders, but to be better for our workers, to be better for our employees, to be better for our customers, to be better for our suppliers, to be better for the communities that we do business with. And that requires a shift in both norms and incentives.
Yeah.
And so the how I would phrase it, Hitendra, is that we can't ask business leaders to lead in a culture with contrary norms, in a system with misaligned incentives.
Yeah.
From a norm standpoint, from a mindset standpoint, you are worth more than the financial value you create for me.
Yeah.
And we need to shift ourselves from measuring each other based upon our net worth to measuring ourselves based upon like our well-being
Yeah.
and the well-being we help create for others. That's a normative change. That's a culture change. That's a mindset change.
Yeah.
And until our mindset change, we're not going to change the companies that we're in. We're not going to change the system, let alone the systems and the structures that constrain the behavior of those companies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your organization talks about inner mastery and outer impact. And I think that's really wise. The change out there starts in here. And that change starts with who do we want to be? Who do we want our kids to think of us as?
Yeah.
What do we think they're going to be proud of? When we pass and our kids are standing up there speaking about us, they're probably not going to speak about how many zeros were in your bank account or how much market share you took. They're going to be speaking about your legacy of impact and care.
Yeah.
And so I think that the fundamental transformation is a transformation of the spirit, of the soul, of imbuing the sacred in our work. And we can do that from wherever. We don't have to be CEO to do that. We can be on the shipping dock. We can be at the retail checkout. We can approach it all through that lens. But then the other thing that has to happen, this is where those companies need to come together. Those find our tribe and all say, it's great if I do this in my company. But one of the things that B Lab realized early on is that companies don't hold the power in a capitalist political economy. Capital holds the power. That's why it's called capitalism. And so any CEO will tell you, including the CEOs of the largest companies on the planet, that they're not where the real power is. The power is with the capital providers. The power is on Wall Street. And it's impossible for any one company to change the behavior of Wall Street. That's going to require policymakers. And so the power of the companies is to work together to create a business constituency, to engage citizens, to engage policymakers, to say, we need a level playing field. We're now taking additional risk by operating this way to create stakeholder value in a system that only rewards shareholder value. We're taking incremental risk in doing that to benefit everybody. Your job is to create a society that benefits everybody. That's why you're elected official. That's what your stated goal is. We can help you do that, but we need there to be a level playing field. We need all companies and all financial institutions to be required to have a widening circle of care. Their duty of care has to apply not only to their shareholders, but to everybody that's impacted by their business. And until we change the incentive structure, what Larry Fink did at BlackRock when he retreated from all the purpose statements that he made in 18, 19, 20, is because the incentives never changed. Until we change the incentives and make it a level playing field, even those that want to lead are often going to get beaten back when there's a shift in political wins and a shift in where power is coming from and how self-interested that power is. And so me, what you said was so spot on, is that we need to unlock the door of the business case jail. We need to then shift the norms of the values of what we're bringing to this, and then we need to change the systems and the structures so the incentives are different.
Yeah.
So that our incentives are to create value for our workers and for our communities, and to safeguard clean air and water, so that our kids and their grandkids can have the same freedom of movement as we do, and the same opportunity to enjoy nature as we do. And we're going to lose that if we don't, because the current system is insatiable, like a cage.
Yeah.
It will keep on consuming us until there's nothing left to consume. It will consume the host. And so unfettered capitalism is a cancer.
Yeah.
Is eating us from within.
Yeah. I'm remembering this moment where the CEO of United Healthcare was shot and killed late last year, and the explosion of social media that was very anti the health insurance companies and United Healthcare in particular, that exploded after that. And to me, that was just one more of just so many signs that we are getting that the way we are operating is reaching its limits. It's reaching its limits. A different kind of contract needs to come into place in the world. So everything you just said really is so thoughtful, so clearly coming from a place of heartfelt and deep honing and structuring and organizing of these ideas, which has been your gift to the world, and while you're very beautifully honoring all the contributors and the interdependence aspect of sort of the tribe, right, that is behind it. It takes someone to kind of come from a place of intellectual rigor, visionary seeing of possibilities, harnessing and galvanizing, and doing the hard work of the iterative, what's not perfect, coming a little bit closer to something more perfect, in a very, very complicated world, that we live in. So kudos to you for all that you're doing on that. And as we enter the last phase of our conversation, I want to turn to spirituality, since it has come up a couple of times in our conversation. The Martin Luther King moment, Birmingham jail, and it's his letter from there is such a great story that you've shared. And for those of our listeners who haven't perhaps had the opportunity to read that letter or understand it in the context of where he was in that moment, it's replete with so many lessons, because he's speaking to a few different audiences there. And you rightfully talked about the moderate white audience as one that he was really trying to really speak to there. I felt in the same way in the challenging conditions that universities have been thrust in with the Israel-Palestine conflicts and other things that have happened in recent years. Party that really needed to be spoken to was the silent majority. Coming to universities because they wanted to earn a medical degree or an engineering degree, some of them with a real hunger to want to alleviate kind of health issues in the world tomorrow or something like that. And and they were quiet bystanders as those who are very emotionally and deeply impacted, in their own ways, rightfully so, on one side or the other, about some injustice that they were really focused on, were essentially dominating, in a sense, the climate on campus, right? As opposed to there being a nurturing of the human spirit and a certain honoring of a certain capacity for university to be a space and a place where, deep and difficult issues can be dissected and, unpacked in a very respectful and collaborative way, and all of that. Somehow we lost that a little bit. And most people want that, actually. Most people want that, but we didn't have that. So anyway, I really love that part. Coming back to the whole spirituality thing, and let's kind of end on that note. You brought, one thought I want to kind of offer in the context of the framework you've just talked about the need for policy change at the Wall Street level, because that's where capitalism really comes from, is those who are owning capital. The sense I get is that what we really need to shift or change is for each individual of their own accord and choice, perhaps with the right nurturing environment around them, start to realize and recognize that there's a lot of joy in doing things that go beyond just material aggrandizement, right? Yeah. You can try to get more power, you can try to get more position, you can try to get more affluence, and that's one way towards happiness. But But there are all these other currencies which are more and more becoming clearer, going on heroes' journeys together,
Yes.
being in a collective rather than just in your isolated splendor of being the individual,
Right.
unleashing creativity and generosity of the heart and gratitude and any or all of that. And if we can get people to place, including those who are, the stewards of capital, where they start to realize that, like, wow, there's a whole set of different other currencies. First of all, that already starts to then move them into a much more multimodal way of thinking about sort of what are all the gods that I'm trying to serve, not just the material gods. But also, my hypothesis is that it probably can be, and that's at least what I'm seeing from some of these organizations you've talked about, where it doesn't actually make you materially like much less successful, because it unleashes a whole different energy in your people, where now they're like super inspired when they come to work. I like to think of it sometimes as the inspired organization, right? Where every day there is joyful engagement with the products and services and advancement of whatever the organization is doing. And when people are doing it joyfully and with inspiration, my expectation is that the productivity and the outcomes and the impact that they can have together is going to be a multiple of what it is in an average day or an average business today.
100%. I agree. Again, once again, Hitendra, I agree with everything you've shared. I think that the orientation of our culture is to perhaps the ugliest four-letter word, which is more. And we need to reorient that to perhaps the most powerful four-letter word, that is care. As my partner, Andrew Kasoy, had said, if we're going to build a new economic system, we have to build it on a foundation of care.
Yeah.
Because the relentless pursuit of more is ultimately destructive, not only of the environment, but of relationships.
Yeah.
Because it forces us to be disconnected and separate from each other.
Yeah.
And I think we're starving for connection.
Yeah.
We've built a culture of separation and hyper individualism, and we need to sort of restitch a culture of care, and which is about a culture of connection.
Yeah.
What better place to do that than in the marketplace, in a business? There's a poem by a Sufi mystic named Baba Kui of Shiraz, the opening line of which is, "In the market, in the cloister, only God I saw." And we would often use that as a final reading in that class that I mentioned earlier that we taught out of the religion department, the Westtown School, that was sort of an applied religion class.
Yeah.
And the idea, this mystic poet said that whether you're looking in the marketplace or in the cloistered realm of a sacred place, only God I saw. Like, I'm choosing to view in either place. I'm only trying to see that of God. And if that were the case, how would I treat this person who works for me? How would I treat this person on the other side of the table in a negotiation? How would I treat this supply contract? How would I treat my vendor? Like, all of those things, if I saw myself. Another way to think of it is, if I only saw myself on the other side of this table in a John Rawls type veil of ignorance test, if I, how would I want this to happen if I didn't know on which side of the table I would be? What kind of relationship would we strike? Like, that ultimately is a quite powerful way to show up in business.
Yeah.
I believe that you said something that what if we can invite people to go on a hero's journey together?
Yeah.
Is I think that so many of our myth making, particularly in the business world, but in our culture generally, is about an individual hero.
Yeah.
The cover of the magazines have a picture of one person. Whenever Bart and Andrew and I, as the three co-founders of B Lab, or when it was Seth and Tom and Ray and Bart and Guy that were the partners at And One, and whenever a magazine or somebody wanted to do a story on us, and they'd say, well, we just need a picture of one of you. So whoever's the CEO will do it. We say, no, that's not how it works. You either take a picture of all of us, or you take a picture of none of us.
Yeah.
Because no one of us is leading this. We're all doing this together.
Yeah.
And there was a hero's journey that we were on together, whether it was building the best basketball company in the world, or building the most beneficial community of businesses in the world, the most purpose-driven community of business in the world. It was much more fun to do it together.
Yeah.
It was much more impactful to do it together.
Yeah.
And so to reimagine the hero's journey as not an individual journey, but as a collective journey,
Yeah.
I think may be the biggest insight that we've talked about in our time together today. And I think I think it was the Dalai Lama was saying that, like, or maybe it was the Buddha, I don't know, but it was a spiritual leader who said, when will the next incarnation be? And maybe it was the Dalai Lama. He said, the next Dalai Lama may be a community.
Mm-hmm.
The next, or Thich Nhat Hanh, the next Buddha might be a community, not an individual.
Yeah.
And I think there is such deep wisdom in that insight. And that also just feels true to my own experience. I've never been able to have more fun by myself than I can have with other people. I've never been able to accomplish more by myself than I can with other people. And so, like, we want to invite each other on to take this hero's journey together. That's the power of the B Corp movement. That's the power of business for good. That's the power of purpose.
Yeah.
We find that with others, not just by ourselves as some ascetic in a cave.
Yeah. Beautiful. So, I'm so lit up with the spirit that flows through you, in this moment, not only just the words and ideas, but really, I know it's come from a deeply grounded and attuned place, something that really is responding to what I think is unfolding in our collective consciousness. So thank you for that, Jay. As we come to closing out our incredibly, sweet and beautiful time with you, I'm going to do two things. One is share, a couple of closing observations from my side, but also pose a question for you to answer, to be giving us kind of the final word, in our conversation today. So the question for you is, what's your big dream, in the next chapter, in your life? Like, what is it that, you're just like looking forward to being a part of and unfolding from within and without, for yourself. So that's my question to you. And before we invite you to answer it, I just want to share one observation. So, I've been blessed to have Yogananda as my kind of like spiritual guide from a very early age, not as somebody to follow with any blind faith, but as a pathway towards accessing the mystic interfaith teachings, in the world. There are two things, that he said, which really connect to so much of what you've been doing in life. So one is when he came to the United States in 1920, and as he started to bring the message of yoga, he also wanted to honor and observe that, listen, by the way, I'm in part bringing you something which is, a ancient science from India, but I also want to recognize that right here in America, I am seeing certain business leaders and entrepreneurs who are devotedly interested in wanting to help advance, humanity in some material way, serve humanity in a material way. They're doing it with deep devotion, with really hard work, concentration, and without really a desire to do it for the sake of making money, do it for the desire of doing the maximum good they can. And they're yogis, in the business world. They're yogis in the business world.
Yeah.
So one thing I found, in your story is just how you were going out there and doing the same thing, honoring and recognizing and finding, in a sense, those yogis in the business world who were already tapping into the power of capitalism, but going beyond it into a form that really speaks to their spiritual core. So I think that is beautiful. And then just the way you're seeking to manifest this kind of, God-like spiritual sacred energy, right? In teachings you've been doing, you mentioned, for a while that you would, you're teaching these students, and in the ideas that you're proffering out there in the world, it sort of reminds me again of one of the quotes from Yogananda that I found personally very both instructive and inspirational. And I think it'll speak to your soul. So he says, spiritualization of material life is the real need of the modern world. We want Christ and Buddhas walking the busy streets of New York and the esplanades of Calcutta, Christ and Buddhas sweeping the streets and running the big banks, performing all duties from the humblest to the most exalted. All duties are important, great ones as well as small ones. Both kinds are necessary for keeping the wheels of the world going. Small or great duties do not make their performers great or small. Both should be performed only by great ones. When all the duties of this imperfect earth will be performed by angelic men and women, when the stock market and the church will be run only by those who are nothing less than prophets, then our earth will be heaven and darkness will be changed into light. I see that in what you're questing to do. And you talked about how it may not be one hero's journey, maybe a collective hero's journey. In my devotion to kind of studying and appreciating Yogananda as a pathway, towards understanding, the richness and complexities of the world. I see you as an extended arm of that tribe of people and teachers out there who are seeking to manifest into practice in our messy material world these beautiful, pure ideas and ideals. So thank you for all you're doing, Jay.
Thank you, Hitendra. That's beautiful. A beautiful way to end. So appreciate that.
Yeah. So tell us about your big dream for the next, decade.
My big dream is I think pretty simple, which is if I can personally stay curious and in community, in pursuit of a higher purpose than just my own well-being, I will be thoroughly used up when my time in this body is done.
Yeah.
And if I can do that, and I can help nurture communities that share that energy to stay curious and build connection, then I think we've got a shot. I think that at the end of the day, our only path through the dark times that we're in and that are coming is if we find each other and we go on that hero's journey together. And I think it's both the path and the destination. Community is both the path and the destination.